I said if he was up there working, he gets to leave early tomorrow. She said, I mean,
Well,
we
yeah,
will not tolerate 4
well,
hours.
it's too early. It's going to be a reading of the budget.
The micro machines.
Yeah.
No.
Do you know of the micro machines, man? Or am I completely dating
You're
myself?
completely dating yourself.
Yeah. I used to have a guy who spoke really fast in micro machines commercials. Yeah, he would.
You're not
He's
allowed
up
to
there
talk
with like
anymore,
Joe
Nathan.
Susie.
It was kind of his gimmick.
So we don't need. So we're not doing a pledge to the flag for this one.
No.
Since there's a.
No, your pledges are good for a minimum of 24 hours.
Okay.
We usually do it at the first meeting.
Yeah.
Okay. That's why I'm asking.
No, good question. We debate it when we put
No,
new pledges together.
I think there's a rule. Pledges are good for a minimum of 24 hours. They last at least 24 hours or until the next meeting.
You have to hand me the hammer.
No. I really got attached to it.
Okay. Good evening. I'm calling the meeting to order for Finance and Budget Committee for March 19th, 2024. This meeting is now in session. Can I get a roll call, please?
Elizabeth Dauberman.
Here.
Mary Lee Hall.
Here.
Samantha Hall. William Hall.
Here.
Jeremy Hash. Jennifer Henkel.
Here.
Nathan Henkel.
Here.
James Holly.
Here.
Here. Okay, thank you. Item 201, public comment. I don't believe we have anybody sign up for public comment. Okay. Moving right along. Agenda item 301, detailed presentation of the proposed 2024-2025 budget and other financial items. I will turn this over to Sue Green and Trevor.
Good evening, everyone. So this evening, we're going to go through the detailed budget. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the first thing we want to go through are our objectives and process for this evening for the budget. So the board approved the resolution to stay within the PDE index of 6.7% at the December meeting. So we'll talk about that this evening. We also will discuss major challenges and budget drivers, review of the work of the administrative team in putting the budget together this year. As always, we're prioritizing our student needs, and we'll review enrollment. We'll understand revenue streams, which is a big piece of this budget. And then we're asking for a consensus for the proposed budget to be approved for the first time at the April 11th meeting. And then, which is always important to everyone, so we start with usually is we are proposing a budget that's balanced with no recommended tax increase for next year. So we usually like to get that out of the way right away. So summary of the 24-25 budget. The entire budget We have increases to revenues of about $845,000 or 1.34%. Increases to expenditures of about $753,000 or about 1.15%. So pretty low percentage increases. But one of the things we're going to point out and we'll talk about in this budget is the impact of the federal funding that we got under the ESSERS money. It was a significant amount of money, as you know, and we planned for that. That will be expiring for the most part during the 24-25 budget, and that's really one of the reasons for the lower increases. So we'll talk a good bit about that. We have no big changes to the budget, so we have stable enrollment and stable programming. So not a real glamorous or exciting budget, not a whole lot of changes, but I will say a very good budget in that we have strong revenue streams and stable expenditures. So from my standpoint, a budget that was pretty easy to put together. Our challenges addressed in the budget. One of the biggest things that we're always looking at, especially in this environment of pretty much full employment, is attracting and retaining staff. So we'll talk a good bit about that. We'll talk about health insurance and where we are with that. And as always, meeting the needs of all of our students in the appropriate environment. We're dealing, like everyone else is, with inflation and pricing instability, coupled with supply chain issues. So one of the big things from a budgeting standpoint is how much do you budget for things and what does it look like? Because you're really guessing on a lot of these things with the pricing instability. And then, as I talked about, that federal funding piece. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Carrington.
Right. So just to give everybody, before we jump into the budget, we'll talk about where we are. So just a highlight of our projections as of right now. So overall, kind of jump to the end, we're about $2 million on our revenue side to the good, and that is comprised of a few things. So local, as you can see, we're projecting about $1.3 million more than we budgeted. That's comprised of many things, but two to highlight. One is earned income tax. That's about $490,000 over our budget. So just the earned income tax that's collected by York Adams Tax Bureau and then sent to us. Interest earnings, we're projecting about $855,000 over our budget. That's really just interest rates are high. They have continued to stay high. So that's just very good news that interest rates have kind of continued, and that's really pushing a lot of our local revenue. As for state revenues, we're about $574,000 over budget. So these are good over budgets. A lot of that is pretty much related to the basic ed funding. Our projected to budget is $568,000. So again, anytime that can go up is a really good thing. And then federal other revenues, that's up $112,000. So overall, most of our budget on the revenue, or most of this year's money on the revenue side is really due to local revenues. And then on the expenditure side of that, just to really show where we're at, we're about $2.3 million under our budget, primarily comprised of salaries and benefits of about $1.3 million. We've described this a lot in our budget presentation. So when salaries are down, benefits are down with them. That's either medical insurance, PSERS and FICA. We'll be talking about that a little bit later. Purchase services is another big category. So we say all because there are three different kinds. There's purchase professional services, purchase property, and then purchased other. Primarily there, when you talk about purchase services, one of the biggest items for us would be tuition paid to other districts or other school entities. That's the biggest category there. That is lower than budget. And then transfers and all other, skip supplies and equipment. That's just lower. That's based on purchases with Easter money that we thought when we budgeted it, we would put it all, we thought we could get it all at this time, but it's actually spread over many years. So we can only recognize a portion of it. And then transfers and other objects, they're down about $100,000. So we're gonna jump into expenditures. So this is just really showing our major cost drivers. We will be talking about all of these items in detail, and this is just kind of what changed from 23-24 to the 24-25 budget. So really not going to spend too much time on this slide, but you can really see that salaries, retirement, medical insurance, transportation, liability insurance comprised most of our changes. We had supplies and equipment that reduced it, and then $96,000 was everything else to get to our budget increase.
If you can go back 1 second there. So one of the reasons why we have asterisks behind salaries, some of these categories look a little lower than what they normally would be because there was a lot of professional development in salaries that we used the ESSER funding for. So Dr. Bryson and Dr. Hughes spoke about some of the new programs that we've put in place on the curricular side. We were able to do a lot of the professional development over the last year using the ESSER funding, and one of the comparative pieces for this budget, although that says $772,000, it is actually higher than that when you pull out the impact of that federal funding. Mr. Carrington will talk about that further in the presentation. This is the time each year where I remind everyone that we are a professional service organization. So our budget is predominantly salaries and benefits because our job is to educate children, and really our staffing is what we use to do that. So that is the bulk of our budget, makes up most of what we have in the school district. So very important piece of what we do. We'll talk about salaries. Salaries are about 42% of the budget on their own. So we talked about the idea of the ESSER funding. So if you remove that component, we are up about 3.61%, which is more, balances more with what our contracts are for our staff. So we do have, we have negotiated salaries for our teaching staff. So we negotiated over the last year a new 5-year agreement with professional staff that begins July 1st, 2024. And the main priorities of that negotiation was including retaining our high quality staff and attracting new quality professionals to the district. So those were the two priorities as we negotiated that contract as we're working through. So as I said, that's a big piece of our budget. We do have the same number of staff as the current year, including one enrollment position. The one thing I'll point out, besides a half-time person, we had a half-time hearing itinerant. We had difficulty filling that position. We've been using contracted services. That has worked very well during this fiscal year, so we are recommending that for next fiscal year also. We also have adjustments to staff assignments. We'll continue to work through those based upon student needs. So depending on what some of our student needs are, we may be moving staff around. So for instance, at the middle school, we may do some changes based upon having a half-time librarian position and maybe a half-time in another teaching area for that individual versus what they're doing now. So we're working through those changes right now and finalizing them, but those are the kinds of things that as we continue to look at enrollment and specific child needs, we'll work through that. But for the most part, we are about the same for staffing. The other thing I'll point out is as we're looking at staffing over the last couple of years, we'll look at enrollment in a couple minutes. We do move our staff where we think the biggest priority is, depending on the needs. So for instance, over the last couple of years, we've taken back some programming. We have 3 autistic support classrooms at the elementary level. Several years ago, we didn't have any. So in those areas, we're bringing back children as we to the district if we feel that we can meet the needs and do that in-house here at the district. So finally on this slide, because this is a lot, as I said, that's the main bulk of our budget, we are also working with our support staff. As I talked about, our professional staff and our teaching staff, we want to make sure that we both keep and attract quality staff. That's the same for our support staff, so we were working through that process right now, and that's part of this budget too, looking at that contract for support staff.
All right, so to talk about retirement, who covered the salaries. This is on the benefit side. So retirement, and in this point, we're really talking about PSERS, which is the Public School Employees Retirement System. As you can see on the slide, it's mandated for all school districts and all school employees to participate in PSERS. That amount is calculated as a % of payroll, and a really positive thing for this year, it went from 34% to 33.9%. So it is like any little drop is a great thing, because as you can see, about 20 years ago, a little bit more, it was 1.15%, and that has increased to a high of 35.26. So that's a really huge increase. To think about it a little bit differently, for every dollar of payroll, we have at least 33 cents, if not more, going to PSERS. So that's just a big amount. Projected rates. So that just shows projected rates based on an actuarial estimate that is provided. So for 25-26, that's 34.72, and I believe it is potentially, hopefully, peaking at 38.26 in 2031-32. So that number does fluctuate over time. It's really just, there's a lot of factors in there, but it's just such a big part of our budget when you think about 30+% of every payroll dollar will go to PSERS. And what this chart does is just show it in a slightly different way over about the last not quite 10 years. So you can see that in 2015-16, the district paid about $5.6 million, almost 5.7, for PSERS in its retirement costs. And compare that to our 24-25 budget, where that number is about $9.4 million. So over that not quite 10-year period of time, we have gone up about $4 million in retirement contributions. One item to note, this number is a gross number, so the district does get 50% back as a revenue item from the state, but still it's a pretty significant increase over that period of time. So probably the next biggest piece when you think of retirements would be insurances, and this is our medical or health insurance chart. So as we've shared before, and we'll continue saying, we're a member of the Lincoln Benefit Trust, so we are self-funded or self-insured for our health insurance. And I would like to kind of slow it down and explain this chart just in a little bit more detail. I know it is hard to see, hopefully in your packet it's a little bit easier. So to start, we're going to look at the 2012-2013-14 area where the two lines meet. So the blue lines are together. At that point, that's showing kind of word it differently. At that point in time, the district was funding its insurance at the same amount it was costing the insurance. So at some point, the lines separate.
So that's the goal. The goal of a self-funded plan is to be exactly where that is. That's very difficult to have happen, and you can see it doesn't happen often, but that's the goal. You're trying to guess where it's going to be. Of course, this is the snapshot afterwards, when we know what the plan costs actually were.
So if we'll separate the lines. Let's follow the light blue line to start. Those are our actual plan costs. So again, we know this after the fact what our actual plan costs are. So in 2013-14, we're there, and then we keep going down. So we continue to go down till you get into about 2019-20, and then 2020, and then you see that big kind of goes up and then really continues. So that light blue line went down and then kind of shot back up pretty quick. Then if you look at the dark blue line, that's what the district is funding for its medical insurance. So again, the lines, they met. We would be looking at some trend data, and they were actuarially prepared rates. So, okay, if you were there in 13-14, you're probably going to keep going up because that's what happens. And that's not what happened. It went down. So we had that dark blue line, and it shot down over a number of years because we were funding it high, and we needed to correct the funding amount. And then the lines touched again in 19-20, and they diverged. So it's a messy process. It's not something that you can really predict. because it deals with real people, with real things that happen. So no one can really predict their medical future, as this chart can show. So we don't really find this information out until after the fact, and we're making estimates based on the future. So we did spend years reducing our funding rate. That's where you can see that blue line going down, the dark blue line going down, because there was significant money that was there because of just where it was being funded. Then the cost switched. So really what this shows is that in December, and just to kind of bring it back to the budget, in December we did recommend the 17% increase in our medical insurance. So that's something that the district is contributing, a 17% increase in our funding of medical insurance. Employees are putting in their share of that as well. That would be the third increase we've had. So it was a, forget 2 years ago, but I think last year was a 15%. So we have seen that really sharp increase. Yep. So one item to note, wouldn't show up on there, but for our health insurance and relating to employee negotiations, we previously were at a 5% employee contribution. So district pays 95%, employee pays 5%. This, or beginning July 1 of 2024, all employees will pay 10%, but they have the ability to only pay 6% should they complete their wellness assessment. So at any rate, that's still 1%, or much more than a 1%, but the share goes from 5 to 6% should you complete that. So the district, having our costs go up, employees are kind of sharing in that as well. So as Sue mentioned earlier, we wanted to show what our federal funding expenditure impact would look like, removed in a way, because it is kind of weird to look at the budget without taking that into consideration. So really what this slide does is just trying to illustrate it a little bit different to show what our actual increase would be. So to go all the way to the bottom, it's about 2.78% budget to budget if you were to remove the ESSER items from the 23-24 budget. Just with such a big program, there are a lot of things that we were doing. So really, it's about a $1.8 million increase compared to the increase that you saw on one of those future slides, or previous slides. So I had mentioned medical insurance, and then we get to talk about the other insurances the district has. This is liability insurance. So really, you wouldn't expect this to be such an exciting thing or such a big cost driver. For better or worse, it is. We have seen a significant cost increase in our liability insurances over the last few years. To really paint the picture, we were over budget in 23-24, and we budgeted a 25% increase for 24-25, really just based on the rate increases we've seen. There are a few factors there. Primarily, our liability insurance went up in our commercial package. Part of it is property insurance coverage. So related to inflation, the cost to replace items increases. So at that point, the insurance companies will kind of really pass that on to the customer, and the increase in our insurance would go up as a result. So the cost to replace repair goods goes up. There's errors and omissions coverage. Really what that is school leaders liability coverages for school districts has also increased over the last number of years, just based on lawsuits happening all throughout the state. So because we're a school district, we also get that insurance increase. Not because of claims we filed, it's just the way of the world, and all insurance companies are really increasing that. Some highlights in a way, workers' compensation coverage, that's been level over the last few years. We haven't really seen the same number of increases, and it's actually gone down sometimes. And cyber insurance, that was one where it would shoot up. It used to be pretty inexpensive, and now it's a much larger driver of liability insurance coverage. However, that we didn't see as much of an increase year over year.
Okay, so another big piece of our budget is transportation. We're contracted with First Student, and we also use LIU Transportation to transport our students. We will be having a presentation at the Thursday evening meeting concerning transportation to go over the complexity of our transportation system, including the fact that we transport home-to-school run students each day, so about 3,000. We also transport special needs transportations to multiple places throughout the area, and then we transport private school students. So we'll be talking about that Thursday night. And I also want to take the opportunity as we're going through this slide to thank our bus drivers. We are very fortunate. The nation is experiencing extreme bus driver shortage. I know the beginning of the school year was really rough for a lot of areas and a lot of districts. We did not have that experience. While we're sometimes a little shorthanded, we've not had that kind of experience. So I take every opportunity to thank our staff for that. They do a wonderful job. Our contract with First Student does have a 5% increase, so that is part of our increase for next year. We also worked extensively, Mrs. Shields and I, to look at special needs transportation and whether we wanted to bring in-house more of our, when I say in-house with First Student, more of our students that we transport to other areas. At this point, we are recommending we continue with the Lincoln Intermediate Unit. The one difference is when we work with First Student, we pay per vehicle. So depending on the number of children, we pay for the cost of the vehicle. When we contract with the LIU, we pay a cost per student based upon dividing up all of the costs for the LIU transportation throughout for all the districts for the number of students that are transported. So if we only have one child going to a particular area, or we have a child that we may have three and then one isn't going there anymore, when you're paying per child, it does have a different look to it than when you're paying per vehicle. So we're recommending at this time that we stay with the current arrangement that we have. So that's some of the behind the scenes budgeting things that are going on. We are recommending the same number of vehicles next year, but we are looking at some of our routes where we have less students and really trying to equalize those out. So one of the big things for transportation is we're really recommending that we be stable, but as we have different buildings in different areas with more students moving, we are looking at maybe moving a bus from one area to another area. And you know, as we describe it Thursday night, the one thing we're going to point out is the students change every year. So at a minimum, they go from this grade to this grade. And a lot of people don't think about that. So as we're working through our planning, that's one of the big things that we need to look at. So now we'll look at enrollment. So this is enrollment for our school buildings only. So this does not include any of the students that we have in any placement or any of the students we pay for both placement or charter schools or any of those other areas. So these are the ones just sitting in our 5 buildings. So you can see our enrollment from 18-19 to present. When we talk about 24-25, we estimated our kindergarten class at the same amount. So that is the one thing I wanted to point out with that. And then the other thing we looked at is if you can look at the high school, they do have a decline next year. But if you roll forward to the following year, it does go back up again. So our classes vary quite significantly right now, a little more than they did in the past. We vary from a low of 197 students in 8th grade to a high of 253 students in 7th grade. And I didn't put the numbers down, but I know when I looked at our first grade class and our second grade class, they're drastically different, kind of like our 7th and 8th grade classes being the highest and lowest in the district. So, you know, as we look at enrollment, we look at this snapshot, but we also look at where we're going the following year. And that was the big piece for the high school. While it does dip down next year, the following year, it will go back up to closer to 900 students. So we talked about meeting all student needs. So in addition to our students in our buildings, we also pay for students to go to York School of Technology, the Lincoln Intermediate Unit, has programs for our students. We also have students placed in other local districts, so if we have a student that has a particular need and there is a place in another district, we work with that other district. We have other educational placements. They may need private school placement. We have our digital academy, and then of course we have charter and cyber charter school students that we pay for. And this amounts to about $5.2 million or 7.9% of our budget. So it is a significant chunk of our budget. So as we talked about, each year we review class sizes and student needs. So we look at staffing, we look at classroom teachers and class sizes, we look at instructional specialists, where we need special education staffs and supports, and then other supports in the classroom. So the one thing we talked about a little earlier was possibly making the move to half-time librarian, maybe gifted, or reading support, or reading support on the other half of that. And again, as we're working through the budget, that's what we do. Roll into special education needs. We look at caseloads at each level and areas of support. And the one thing we do with this also, when we meet with Dr. Rogers and Dr. Reppert, is we look at, just like I was talking about the high school, we also kind of forecast where are we going in the next couple years for that classroom size. Because some of these classroom sizes by law are 8 to 10 children. So if we have children moving through the system, what's that going to look like in 2 years or 3 years so that we can make sure we can forecast for that. So our recommendations here. We added a third elementary autistic support classroom using contingency in the fall of 2023. So in August, we realized due to the number of students that we had with this need, we added that third classroom. We thought it was best for the students to have them here versus out in placement, and we also know that, again, looking to the future, we believe that we need that capacity, which we know we do for this year. So we're recommending maintaining that. And on the slide it says contingency, so at that point in the budget year, it was August, we really couldn't make transfers yet, we were recommending using contingency. We now know that we had staffing money, so we didn't actually end up making that transfer from contingency, but at that time it was very early, we just started the fiscal year. We talked about the half-time itinerant, removing that earlier, and then, as I said, we will adjust current resources based on class sizes throughout the district. So right now we're looking at the best use of exactly where our paraprofessionals are throughout the district to make sure we're meeting needs. Okay. Really fast. So this is elementary enrollment class size. So we look at this quite frequently. As I said, we assumed that kindergarten was going to be the same as the current year. Kindergarten was pretty low on the lower level for the current 23-24 school year. So there is that possibility we'll have a bigger kindergarten class next year. If so, we do have one enrollment position in the budget for that purposes, and that's also the reason why we keep contingency. So 2 years ago, we hit the end of July, beginning of August, and we had a whole lot of kindergartners register at Southern Now, and we had to add 2 kindergarten classrooms, so we had 5 in that year. So we are ready for those things to happen, because in March we don't exactly know what our kindergarten classroom looks like. So you can see our elementary class sizes are a little lower than normal, so in a good place. So this is our staffing compared to peers. So we also look at, do we have enough staffing overall compared to our peers? This is based on 22-23, which is the most recent data out there. We are pretty much in the middle with everyone else, a little on the lower side, but not too far below that. So last year, if you watched our presentation, you saw our line was exactly on the average line. We're dipping a little bit below. Yes.
So that's students per teacher, so a lower line actually means higher staffing, doesn't it? The fewer students per teacher would be more staff, right?
Yeah, that's what I meant. We have lower class size, is what I meant to say.
Okay.
Maybe I didn't say that.
Okay, you were saying staffing, you were saying lower. I was thinking, wait.
Oh, no, with lower class size
Okay, great.
is what sorry about that.
The other thing should point out too is that particular graph is showing all professional staff Is that accurate?
Believe
Because
it-
if you go back to
believe it's
elementary,
classroom. Is it-
So
is it
that
classroom?
one is classroom teachers
Teachers,
only.
classroom teachers.
this one. Got
Yeah,
it.
this one's classroom teachers. So if, on the PDE reports, if they're classified as a classroom teacher, then that's the data they're using.
Thank you.
So that was our brief picture of expenditures. So as you know, there's two halves to the budget. Second half is our revenue side. So I'll talk us through what that looks like for 24, 25. So our local revenue, that in a really wonderful way continues to increase. So kind of as we started, we have two highlights, and we'll talk about real estate assessment. So our real estate, we have about a 1% increase in that amount this year. One item to note, that is really the biggest item we have control over. So as a district, we were able to increase property taxes. So just to highlight, but that is a 1% amount that it's increasing. And really what that is, that 1% is just based on assessment growth because we're not recommending a tax increase. Earned income tax, that is, we're expecting, or we budgeted about a $678,000 increase, or 11.7% with an asterisk. I'll explain what that means in a future chart. It relates to a payment we got a couple years ago and a delay, so just an anomaly to explain that. And interest earnings, this is really building off of what we explained earlier with our projections. Interest rates continue to stay high. We really wouldn't have expected interest to really stay this high for this long, as we'll show in a future chart. And then just one item to decrease, or to highlight for a decrease, is our delinquent real estate taxes. That's gone down for the budget about $50,000. Everything else on the local side was relatively stable and no big change. As I mentioned, we have a handful of charts for you. So what this does, it shows about a 15-year summary of our change in assessment values. So the bars just represent the dollar amounts, and then that squiggly line represents our percent assessment increase. So you can see on the chart we had some pretty explosive growth between 2021 and 21-22 to the tune of about 1.75% increase in our assessment. So that was huge. It was a very big increase. After that, it's leveled off. Still been much higher than what we've seen in the past. It's been around a 1% increase. So our budget this year was a 1% increase in assessment. We haven't quite hit that yet. We're we're at about 0.37%. We do have more edits coming. So an edit would be something we get from the assessment office saying whether or not more properties are on the tax rolls. So we'll see where that comes in at the end of May. That's when we get our final edit from them. There is more than just to this whole number, there's a collection percentage. So it's not just hitting your assessment. It's a blend of the two to really how we estimate our earned income tax for each year for the budget. Sorry, real estate tax, not earned income. So next up is interest earnings. What this chart is meant to really show is how difficult that's been to project for the last few years. You can see we've had a low in this 10-ish year period, about $22,000. This year we're anticipating about $1.5 million in interest earnings. That's contributed because interest rates have increased. During the pandemic, we were getting about 0%. Now we're getting well over 5%. Coupled with we have fund balance. So having fund balance, we have more money to earn interest on, so that is just increasing that number. It does go down next year. So we're anticipating a decrease in interest rates, and in talking with some of our financial advisors, they were saying really they are expecting it to decrease. So don't kind of be liberal with that and to expect some decreases. And one thing to note about interest earnings, it's a really wonderful thing in the budget to have. So it really helps, and it's a really great increase to our local revenues. However, it's very difficult to take that out. So as you can see, just a few years ago, we had almost no interest earnings. Now we're over $1 million. So we don't want to over budget in that category, because over budgeting would just be very difficult to really figure out how to work that back in a different way. And you can see how quickly they've gone up. There's the possibility they will come back down just as quick. Hopefully not. But. All right, so earned income tax. There are a couple of colors on this chart, and we'll try to explain really what we are looking at. So it's really meant to summarize the growth of our earned income tax revenues over the last several years. So from 2021 all the way to 24-25, we've seen some very good growth. It's gone from about $5 million to our budget of $6.5 million in 24-25. Now to explain the blue versus the orange that you may see on the screen. So what the blue is meant to represent are the actual or projected budgeted earned income tax revenues we have for each year. So you can see the first 4 or 5 years, those are level, and first 4 years will match the orange, and then the last 2 match the orange. What happened is that in 21-22 and 22-23, we received a large payment in September of 2022, just based on the way our accounting works and the modified accrual accounting that we must follow. That payment we would typically get in August, and it would accrue back to the 21-22 year. But because that payment came a few days later in September, it was paid to us in September, it counted for 22-23. So that is why the blue 22-23 is much higher than the orange 22-23. So what we tried to do is adjust that, so that's what the orange lines represent, is just a recalculated adjusted amount taking that into account. So if we follow the trend of the orange lines, which is how we did our budget this year, it's much more steady growth. So 23-24 is projected at a 5% increase over the adjusted prior year actual. And then 24-25 is about a 3% increase over our projected 23-24 amount. So what we're doing there is really just trying to understand where the changes came, what we can do to hopefully anticipate it better for future years.
Let me throw another reason why earned income tax are very difficult to predict or project. We do not receive over 50% of the revenue from this until after May of the current fiscal year. So until May of this year, we won't get over half of this. So in May, June, July, and August, we'll get between 50 and 60% of this revenue stream. So it's very difficult for us to determine what it looks like when we have very few receipts to go by.
It looks like it was flat for a while, and then it's been increasing, but the increases look kind of stable if you take out the anomalies. So I understand you don't get a lot of the receipts, but if the much longer history is also pretty stable, that would help.
Well, on this chart, the only history we have is 21-22 and 22-23. We're estimating 23-24 and 24-25.
Yeah.
So we really only have 2 years of what actually happened, since it was pretty flat. So that's where, again, that's what we're estimating, exactly what you're saying, that we're going to have these small jumps. That's what we believe is going to happen, but it is really a big estimate at this point, because there's so few receipts. So I see what you're saying, but I agree with you that, yeah, that's what we believe it's going to happen, but we only have really those 2 years, and they're the ones where the payments were.
What would tend to produce volatility in that number? Salaries, if the same people are living here and they're generally maintaining their employment, I could see the rise happening because of inflation. Inflation has affected wages, so these might be nominal numbers, the real numbers might be flat. But are there other factors that?
That's the main piece, or people not paying.
Oh, okay.
So now, if you work for an employer, of course, it's deducted, it's turned in. But if you're self-employed, or an organization wouldn't turn it in, that would also impact it.
So non-payment would be one of the main sources of volatility, potentially?
Potentially,
Okay.
or unemployment, depending on, and again, we know there's not
Right.
a lot of that. but-
Sorry, yeah, and under the current circumstances where everybody's kind of, they're employed, they're probably,
Yep.
I don't think there's a lot of, I guess there's movement, but there's not a lot of movement in terms of earning a very vastly different wage
Right.
for people right now, so,
So,
okay.
yes, we're all on the same, we agree with you completely that that's what we're predicting.
okay, yeah.
So that took us through the highlights of the local revenue side. And now to talk about our state revenues. This, for a number of years, wasn't really a fun highlight. It was just kind of, oh, we don't know. But now we know some things, and we can talk about it. Basic education funding, our budget increase was $765,000. There's two pieces to that. So the change from the 23-24 budget to our actual is $569,000. That was the increase. And then we have an added amount for BEF, or basic ed funding, of $196,000. So what we were doing is taking the amount that is in the governor's budget for our district. There are two pieces to that, so we'll call it the standard increase to basic ed funding, and then you may have heard something along the lines of a large additional amount relating to a funding lawsuit called the State's Adequacy and Tax Equity Supplement. That we are not including, and that is not part of that. That's a much different number, and there's a lot of politics involved there. So this, the number we included, the 196, that's more of just the stable increase. We have seen increases in our state revenues over the last several years, so that is why we do feel comfortable including that. Special education funding next is budget is up $158,000. Part of it is a $54,000 increase just to bring us up to our current year budget, and then another $104,000 is what is included in this, the governor's budget. One item of a decrease is the PCCD safety grant. That went down $86,500. However, the really big part, it's a positive sign. This is one of the first times it's been in consecutive budgets. So seeing that amount is a really big highlight. While one part did go down, there is a competitive piece, so we'll see what that really shakes out to be for us. All other state changes were pretty immaterial at $9,226.
So the one piece, if you go back real quick, the one piece with the PCCD safety grants that we really appreciate, although that part of the budget was not passed until December, one of the things that they did that was really good that they've not done in the past is they said you have until December of 2025 to spend that money. That is very helpful for us because we can now include it in the 24-25 budget and use it the way we best think meets the needs of our students. Before, with budgets, it would be, they may not pass it till December and you had till June 30th to spend it. So that never works well. So we did really appreciate that that was part of the planned approval this year, that we had more time to use it in the best way possible.
This is just a chart really showing some of our the change in total state revenues over the last several years. You can see it's fluctuated a little bit, but overall, over time, it has been increasing. Most of it has been that right around 21, 22, where the total number has been going up. So that's just a quick illustration of that. And then 23, 24, 24, 25, just the projection and the budget, not actual quite yet. Last piece of our revenue puzzle would be federal revenue. This number is going to trend much more normal and for the district from what it's been prior to the pandemic. So we have only $569,000, so about 0.89% of our total revenue, so about 1%. We knew this was coming. It's our planned decrease from the ESSER funding. We've really had this plan since we learned about getting it. It's a 72% decrease, or a drop of $1.51483 million. Just to highlight, the ESSER funding is ending, and that must be spent by September 30th of 2024. We do have some ESSER funding in our budget for 24-25. That is the planned purchase of Chromebooks. That'll happen in July. That way we get hopefully all of our spending done, don't have to worry about that September 30th deadline. Really, our federal programming for the district are the title programs, so Title I, II, and IV. We had increases because those amounts were increased. We really don't find out what those amounts are until May, June timeframe, so we really just always base them off our projections. And then grants. So we continue to seek out and apply for grants. There are a couple different kinds of grants that we're going to highlight. So last year in May, we applied for the School Violence and Prevention Program grant, also known as COPS. That's through the Department of Justice. We applied for about $500,000 of grant funding for safety projects. We were not awarded, but we attempted to get that. Another one that I can say we did get was the Farm to School grant. So that was $15,000. We recently received our hydroponic equipment, so that's exciting for all of our schools. And then to highlight just a couple of the ones that came out, it's that PCCD grant that ties to the budget. So we have a meritorious grant of $40,000 that we will receive. Another one for behavioral health, about $137,000, and then a competitive grant that we submitted last month, and that we submitted $450,000 of potential grant funding. So we won't find that out until about the end of May. Kind of a little late to fit in our budget, but that would be very helpful should we receive that. And grants are something that we as the district keep looking for.
One question, if I may, please.
Yeah.
So the environmental grants that are coming up that we can apply for beginning in May, what are your thoughts on that? Is that something that you're keeping your eye out on?
So anytime there's
Asbestos speaking.
Absolutely. So anytime there's a grant that we would qualify for, especially in that scenario, it would be something we'd look at and apply for.
Okay. So this could change, right?
Yeah, oh, no, we hope to continue to add to this list should those things come up.
Thanks.
And I believe that grant is the one that's retroactive to July 1st, 2023. So we'll definitely take a look.
Also, grants are often for a particular purpose, and so in a lot of cases, they don't have a huge net budget impact, like they may around the margins. If you get a grant for $450 and you need to spend $500 to finish the project, then you're out $500, then you're out $50,000. But if the grants reasonably match the use, then they're not a big net budget impact. Is that generally the case?
For the most part, there's not a matching component. If there would be a matching component, we would bring it to the board ahead of time to make sure that everyone's on the same page with that. The other thing is in Pennsylvania, you may increase your budget for state and federal grants or funding that comes in without redoing the whole budget process. Now, local's a different ballgame, but state and federal.
This really will just wrap up our overall revenue picture. So it's about an $845,000 increase in our revenue from 23-24 to 24-25. It's not adjusting for any of our ESSER funding, but overall just an $845,000 increase. And really to show how that pie works out, 66% is our local revenue, 33% is our state, and then we're back to normal with 1% being our federal revenue.
Okay, so we're going to try to summarize what we've been talking about. So let's talk about the reasons why we have a basis for no tax increase for next year. as we've talked about for the last 4 years, we really wanted to make sure that our ESSER funding, that we used it in a way that we didn't fall off the fiscal cliff. So you'll hear about that a lot. Years ago when we received federal funding, it was a little different situation. It's very easy to have that happen. I know we went to the Pennsylvania Association of School Business Officials conference a couple weeks ago, and there were presentations where people talking about they had to cut 13 positions because they pretty much used the funding to put staff in and then fell off the fiscal cliff, had no way to fund it after that. So we did plan for that by scaling down the use of federal funding from 100% to 50% to 25% as we went along to make sure that, well, I think it was 100%, 75, 50%. So we made sure we didn't have those kinds of issues. Plus, we were careful on how many positions that we put in. We also put in positions that we had recommended prior to the pandemic. So it wasn't like we were adding positions. We were putting in things that we knew were essential. And if we needed a tax increase to keep them, they were priorities that we had to have. But luckily, we were able to keep them without that. We also, Trevor talked quite a bit about the increase in local funding. Local funding is really coming in very high. The one thing I'll caution everyone about is, especially that interest earnings number, if that comes back down, we will have a big hole in our budget. So I just want to make sure, as we're working through things, and people understand it's really good, and we're going to take advantage of those interest rates and get as much money as we can for the district. But if that comes back down, we could have up to a $1.5 million hole in our budget. I guess next year we have budgeted $1.1 million, but still over $1 million that it potentially could come back down again if interest rates decline. But right now, these are things that are making this a little easier job. So the next piece, same with state funding. I've been doing this a whole long time. I've not seen state funding flow like it has been. Because the state funding is flowing, we are able to do what we need to do without having a tax increase. So I said after the recession that I would not say it's a bad budget year unless it really was. And from the standpoint of state funding, we really are getting more of those increases that we really need to see. So it's greatly appreciated, and because we have that, we're able to make things work. We also have a change in our budget methodology for calculated use of fund balance. I'll talk about that in a minute or two here. We've been talking about not being fully staffed throughout the year. And that does create where we're running a budget surplus. So we took a real close look at that and how we can address that. We have stable enrollment, as we talked about, maybe a little bit dip next year at the high school level, but we know that's going to come back up again. Because we have that stable enrollment, we're able to do what we need to do with our existing staff. We have negotiated contracts. I can't say enough about that. It is very difficult to put a budget together when you don't know what the numbers are going to end up at. So that is very helpful that we've been able to negotiate timely and have know for sure what it's going to look like. We've had those positive results from last year. So one budget builds on the next budget. That's very important. And then we did pull out additional millage. So based on our long-term capital plan, we were going to add additional millage in next year for debt service. We did not add additional millage, nor did we take out the millage that we had in there. So we'll talk about that. But because we did not add that, we didn't need the extra money in the budget. So other budget changes, decisions, just because I know it's been talked about a little bit, this does not include an additional school resource officer. So that came up. We just wanted to make sure that everyone understands at this point it does not. We have a reduction in contingency to $300,000. That's the typical level that we have it at. So we are recommending that. And it does include $50,000 for the firefighter tax credit program and $105,000 for the senior tax credit program, which is what those programs are funded at right now in 23-24. So we think that's sufficient. Talked a little bit about our financing plan for all buildings. So we've been phasing in the millage. We've not added any more for 24, 25, but currently our debt service is 4.8 million, and we have budgeted 5.6 million. So that is about an $800,000 difference. That would flow into fund balance for future capital needs in the district. And then we would also recommend, we have about 6.3 million in our debt service fund, that we transfer that back to the general fund. If we are not going to issue more debt, there's no need to keep that money over in the debt service fund. So we're recommending we transfer that over and that we reserve that for capital needs, renovations and maintenance of existing buildings. So go through the history of our tax increases. Over the past 5 years, we've had low tax increases. So over the last 5 years, we've only had one tax increase. So this will be, out of the last 6 years, we'd only have one. So we've tried to keep taxes pretty low in the district. And this chart just shows, so I'll go pretty quickly through these. We are proposing that we stay at 19.91 mils. That shows we are significantly lower than other districts. And on the right-hand side, it just kind of shows if we had that millage, how much it represents in additional taxation in the district. Fund balance use. So one of the things, we have been driving larger surpluses in the last couple of years than we historically have for a couple reasons. One of the reasons we talked about, state funding and local funding is higher than what we've seen. With interest rates being up, with earned income tax, with full employment, we are seeing those numbers higher. In addition to the state funding numbers, I've never seen in my career the state funding numbers that we're seeing. So that's all driving a higher revenue number than, and it's very hard to predict some of these things. And so we are driving a surplus on the revenue side. Additionally, we know that we're not 100% staffed. Before we would, if we had someone out on leave, as we talked about a couple times, if we had someone out on leave, we would have a long-term sub that we can bring in. We'd have our positions filled at all times. That is not the case now with basically full employment. We're doing much better. I feel in 23, 24, there's a lot less vacancies than we were experiencing the last several years, but we're still not 100%. We're still working through that. So what we took a look at is we took a history of where we were running surpluses and generally what they were. And our recommendation is that we set our fund balance use to not exceed the calculation of 1% of revenues and 3% of expenditures. We feel that this is a comfortable level in that we are not overtaxing, but we also aren't putting ourselves in a situation where we're under budgeting. So that not to exceed number is about $2.6 million. So our fund balance, right now, we do have quite a bit of fund balance, and that was planned, as we know. That was part of our long-term capital plan for building renovations. So right now, as of June 30th, 2024, we're estimating about $23.3 million. We always have unassigned of 5% per board policy. And then we have our budget deficit for 24-25 would actually be 2.4 million. So remember on the slide before I said not to exceed 2.6, we would need 2.4. And then we'd have about 17 million assigned for future capital projects. And then accounting mumbo jumbo will say we have restricted or non-spendable of about 200,000 usually when we do the audit at year end. So that's really where our fund balance picture is. And then this is how we balance the budget, so that's that 2.4 million. So we have revenues of 64 million, expenditures of 66 million. And the one thing I always make sure people understand here, in Pennsylvania, you cannot exceed your expenditures, so we always make sure we never want to hit 66.4 million. Like, that's not the goal to exactly hit that because we can't go over. So always want to point that out. And I want to go through where our other funds are in the district. We do this at every budget presentation just to make sure everybody knows, course, you can look at our financial statements, all those kinds of things, but we always want to talk about where we have funds in the district. So we have that debt service fund, about $6.3 million that I just talked about. We're recommending that we transfer that back over to the general fund. We have capital reserve fund for budgeted projects. So if you remember, we've done transfers over there, so that they're for assigned projects. We have a retirement fund of about $316,000, $317,000. This is not PESERS, so I want to point that out. So PESERS is the Pennsylvania School Employees Retirement System, and that's through the state. This is for, we do longevity or loyalty retirement stipends per our contracts. So this is what this is for, and this stabilizes. So if we have 0 retirees or 2 retirees this year and we have 15 the next year, kind of stabilizes in the budget, so we have a separate fund that we keep there. And we kind of adjust the amount of the transfer based upon where we are with that. We also have our food service fund of about $641,000. I can tell you, pre-pandemic, we would stand up here and say, yeah, it's a negative $200 and some thousand. So that has definitely come around with the availability of more free lunches and for free breakfast for students. And then we have the capital projects fund. Basically, we're showing as of June 30th, 2023, that's about $21 million, but it is money that is definitely for the high school, needed for the high school, and in addition to that money, we also need part of that fund balance back on the previous screen. We still need about a little over $5 million. So again, it's all allocated for, let me go back there because I missed that. When we looked at fund balance, that $17 million, about $6 million of that is needed for the remainder of the high school and for our sewer project. So it's already allocated for that. So budget next steps, we are recommending approval of the proposed budget at the April 11th board meeting. It does not include a tax increase, but we don't do anything with the tax increase at the April meeting. We only set the tax rate once, so we won't talk necessarily about the tax amount at the April meeting. It'll just be approval of what's called the PDE 2028. So that is the form that the budget must be on in order to be approved. When we give you your electronic documents of the budget, which will be by Thursday, there will be 2. There will be our detailed budget, which is like 50 to 60 pages and has words and descriptions and those kinds of things on it. That's the one I recommend you look at. But then it does reconcile to the PDE 2028, which is really just a bunch of numbers for 1 year. There's no comparative. So that's why we give you 2. We're required to give you the 2028, and that's what you're actually voting on. But the other budget actually gives you the descriptors and the comparative information. So it's important that we approve that in April, as we talked about before, so that we can do final approval at the May 16th board meeting. That's when we set the tax rate. That's when we talk about the homestead farmstead amount. We will learn in early May what the amount is and get the information from the county to calculate that. And because the meeting's so early this year, we will scurry to get that done. And then if that's all approved in May, then we can prepare to get the tax bills out, and we send those out by July 1st, and that is important that we kind of stay to that timeline. Okay, questions?
Yes, if I may. So in moving the debt service fund, the $6.2 million, over to the fund balance, are you proposing to put that into the assigned budget portion?
Yes, for capital renovations.
Okay, and I'm assuming that the $2.9 million surplus also went to that assigned fund?
It did, yes.
So then, so the surplus this year essentially was $2.9 million, and you have that we put into the assigned portion. We'd also be adding in the $6.2 million into the assigned fund, which is essentially about just a hair over $9 million added to the assigned future capital projects budget. Is that correct?
So one thing I want to clarify. So the amount for the surplus for this current 23-24 is already factored into that.
Into the 17?
Yes, into that, let me go back to that slide.
Oh, so you already have it in the 17?
Yes.
You've already added
The
it.
only thing we don't have in there, Mr. Hall,
But in
is,
this current year, if we transfer over the 6.2, and we've already included the essentially 2.9, we'll have added to that in this year from combining the other fund in about 9.1
yes,
million.
It also sounds to me like since we haven't actually moved to 6.3 almost,
No, it's still
and you said there's about 6 million in the assigned that is needed for the high school, that's almost going to offset, is that right? So yes, that 17 million will drop 6 million, but then it'll also
Right.
regain 6 million. So that's actually a pretty good number for us to think about in terms of what's
right,
available in there.
yes,
Uh,
yep.
So in,
Does that make sense, Mr. Hall?
yeah, no, so in the event of, say, worst-case scenario happening in 24, 25, where we show a deficit of 2,415,000, that juxtaposed against what would be this year's surplus from the budget, that's a difference of about $560,000. If you just look at those two numbers, so this year's surplus plus next year's potential overrun. So that $560,000, I think we should give that back to the taxpayer. I mean, that difference, if we're taking a different approach on large capital projects, I don't see why we continue to grow that fund at that pace. Now, I don't know that we don't want to grow, we don't want to necessarily shrink it, but even at that worst-case scenario, it would be fund balance neutral. If we returned that $560,000 to the taxpayer, it would be fund balance neutral at our worst-case scenario. Am I correct in my numbers?
Yep, you're correct in your numbers.
So, I mean, I don't know what the rest of the board thinks of that.
How? Like, what are you proposing? Like, not,
I'm proposing, it would probably be a negligible
but I mean,
decrease in millage, but
okay, that's.
Well, decrease in millage
Or-
it typically would be in perpetuity unless you're going to raise taxes the following year.
So you mean a tax cut? Is that what you're?
that is exactly
Okay,
what
all
I'm
right.
saying. I mean, sure, worst-case scenario can happen, it's certainly possible. But it's also possible that we could end up with a surplus, again next year. And I think that's a pretty negligible number in light of
What's the math?
66 million.
What would the tax cut be for that size
Well,
amount?
I haven't run those numbers, but I think to echo something I've some discussions we've had. Yes, that works out. Of course, in all these cases, we're predicting numbers 1 year out. Whereas when you set a tax rate, those are expected to be kind of sticky and last for many, many years. And so I think if the concern would be, are we going to lower taxes and then some of these sources of funding are going to go away, like the interest rates? And then we'll have to raise in order to accommodate that. And so one idea I floated is if we, and I think we need to look at it very carefully, but if we're in a place where we do feel like we've accumulated more fund balance than is really appropriate for us to keep, something you can do that's maybe a little safer until your projections long-term are justifying it is a rebate. So you can give a rebate to say, look, we've accumulated a certain amount of money, and we feel like, I think we could each come up with a level that we think appropriate. I think that actually would maybe need a lot of discussions about further out projections. But whatever level we feel like is appropriate for the things that we can foresee and maybe worst case scenarios 5 and 10 years out, there is some level above which you say, okay, we got to return some of this. But if you're concerned about some of these sources of funding going away, a rebate is a safer way to do that, to kind of dip your toe into that, returning money, because I think there is a moral responsibility at a certain point to return money to taxpayers. But there's also, you don't want to be moving the tax rate up and down all the time.
So is there a mechanism that can be done in?
I would have to look into the rebate. The only other way I could think would be lowering the tax rate. But the one thing and again, I would definitely have to do a lot of research with the attorneys on this, because the one thing with taxes, I'll take the homestead farmstead for example. That's prescribed. Everyone gets the same homestead farmstead. Doesn't matter what your property's worth, you get the same homestead farmstead. So I'm not sure with a refund if it's that same type of thing, or if you can base it upon what they pay. So I guess the question would become would you want the rebate to be based upon what was paid, or would you want it to be the same rebate to every taxpayer? Because they are two different things. And then you'd really have to look at exactly when you want that, like who owns the property at what point in time, like there's sticky things like that.
What would be the argument for not doing a completely ignorant question, but by what's paid? Like, what, help me
Well,
understand.
I'm not saying there's an argument. I'm saying
yeah.
there could be something in law that says you have to.
Or we
Yeah,
may
so
want to
I'm not arguing that that's the way
yeah.
you do it. I'm saying some of these things I'd have to look into is
Absolutely.
what is allowable. If
Is
you
the
were to-
senior rebate just a flat amount per person?
The senior rebate is actually based upon your income and varies from $500 or $250 to $650
Okay,
based
but
upon
it's
income.
income-based rather than property
Right.
value-based, so it's
Yeah.
not based on the taxes you're paying, it's based on income.
The only thing, Mr. Hinkle, it's based, so if you get our rebate, you would also get a state rebate. You can't get more than what you've paid. So that's the only thing we double check is, okay, if you get the state rebate and you get our rebate, we just want to make sure you paid that amount of taxes.
We don't want to be, giving more.
Yes, you can't get a credit.
Right.
Yeah.
So if I might counteract that a little bit and say, while the board may decide to go a different direction for building projects of greatest need, at this point, we don't have a number on that, meaning while Shrewsbury may at this point be, if you were to go with the existing project, $25 million project. But we've got 3 buildings that are going to be in need shortly within the next 3 to 5 years. And that would probably easily chunk up the 17 million. And that's just projects of greatest need amongst those 3. So I think that's the other thing to consider is, while it may be a rebate up front, is it a long-term debt pooled when you need? So in my mind, as I think through that, I would recommend the board sees what the project of greatest needs and what those costs are before entering into looking at giving what's in the account back. I just think
I wasn't, in fact, what I was suggesting was being fund balance neutral. I mean, and that was what my attempts were at the $561,000 essentially. Even at our worst case scenario, meaning we overran the budget all the way to the top number, which you said we can't actually exceed.
Right.
So the maximum we would be able to exceed would be 2.415. so 2,415,000. But this year's surplus was 2,976,000. So the difference being the 561,000, not touching the existing assigned fund balance value. You follow what I'm saying?
No, I'm with you. I think it's a matter of whether the board would opt to, you continue to put the 500,000 in to save for those projects, because I don't think it'll end at 17 million. Or you worry about that later and give the, you reassign the 500,000. So I might be thinking about it differently, but in the sense of I'm saving for a home construction project, I would much rather save up and spend it when I have it and have less debt later than I'm going to spend it on something else and not have it and worry about the debt later. That's just,
I think maybe what
that's
you're
a
saying-
simplified way of thinking
Yeah,
about it.
maybe what you're saying is that you could, so the idea of going to become, becoming fund balance neutral depends on your future projections. Whether being fund balance neutral is appropriate depends on whether you think that your revenues and expenses are going to be stable or whether you think there are going to be increases in either. If you don't think if you don't think any revenues are going to go away, and there are some concerns about the interest rates in particular, and if you think your expenses are going to remain stable, which you're bringing up that there may be expenses coming that we don't know about yet, then being neutral for your current environment isn't necessarily neutral to the future environment.
I totally understand that. I just think that in light of the portion of the $66 million that our community provides the school with, $561,000 is a token gesture.
Certainly as a one-time rebate, it's a very small amount of money. As an ongoing thing, it accumulates.
Yeah, I think we're already, as it shows here, we're already the lowest millage in York County. Yeah, that's,
But I think that
and
millage can
that's-
be a little, millage is a percentage, right? But a percentage of what really matters? A home in York City at, $30,000, sure, they're a much higher percentage rate, but it's a much higher percentage rate of a much smaller number.
Yeah.
However, I do think it's responsible to wait for a feasibility study, see what we're looking at as far as what's needed, maintaining what we have here now and what needs correction, and then maybe revisit it. And I don't think it's
No.
responsible to take more than what we need
But
from the
knowing what we
taxpayer,
need.
and then
Yeah.
be okay with that and say, oh, well, I'm saving this. Well, not right now, because it's just, folks are struggling with inflation and things like that. We don't need to take more than we need, but at the same time, we have to strike a balance of responsibility. What we actually are looking at for maintaining our buildings is important too.
Along
Yeah,
those lines, I was wondering, it occurs to me that the discussions of lowering a tax rate, given that we don't know what the greatest needs are, that's time sensitive, but a rebate isn't time sensitive, correct? Like, we'd have to know if we were hypothetically lowering the tax rate, we'd have to have.
You have to have more of a projection
But
in
a
order to take.
rebate is not
this is the
time
bold move.
sensitive. That could be a wait and see, with the idea that, wouldn't it be nice, in this hypothetical world, find our greatest needs balance that we have, and the rebate could still be an idea that doesn't have to be time sensitive, am I correct in thinking that?
I think that in either case, I think you want to, the rebate does not require you to project out as far.
Correct.
Yeah, I would say. I wanted to say, so I'm not only countering what Bill said, and to give a little bit of a counter to what you said, I don't disagree. It will always be the case that there's stuff to project that we don't know. And so if we always wait until we've projected all of the future, we would never pass a tax cut under any circumstances. So I think your argument is good, but it needs a limiting principle, and I think that's something we're going to have to develop, and I think we may all have different limiting principles on that, but I think it should have a limiting principle for everyone, that yes, we do need to project out into the future, but that can only go so far. At a certain point, you do have to make a decision
And the
based on the
counter-
information you have at the time.
The counter I would add to that is reasonable anticipation for what we don't know versus things that we literally do know. And so we know that there is coming to us a greatest needs. We know that. That is knowable.
But we don't know the numbers.
But we don't know the numbers, but we still know it's a need, right? And so what we're trying to figure out is how bad is this need? But then the idea of, well, we can't project it so much because of the unknowable, but we do know that's coming.
I think I may have also missed something you were saying with asking if it's time-bound. You were saying millage is established at a particular time of year.
Yes.
Whereas a rebate can be issued at any time of year, and so we could,
Wait on
get
what
more
the greatest
information.
needs is, not
Yes.
get locked into any kind of tax issue, and then potentially offer a rebate based on the reality that we have that we don't have yet.
Yeah, so we could talk, and so once we have, because we know there's one, there are all the unknowns that we just have to do our best with, but we have one big known unknown, which is the greatest needs.
That we know is coming.
That I think it would be wise to see that
True.
Yeah.
before taking any major action.
Agreed.
And then that can inform, and then just over the next year, I feel like, and this isn't necessarily a flaw, and especially given the environment of the past 5 years or so, it's got to have been very difficult to predict more than 1 year out. I'm very sensitive to that, but I think that we may want to try to start to predict a little further out than we have been, if we think the environment is stabilizing, which compared to what it's been, I can't say for sure that it would stabilize, but it seems reasonable to think that it might. that there might be some stability in areas that there hasn't been over this very, very volatile period that we've had. So I think projecting our budgets a little further out is maybe something we need to start the exercise of doing.
Right. Or at least, even taking some of our projections as far as the retirement costs and, plotting them out not just next year, but a couple of years out. Obviously, you're guesstimating, you can't go that far out. We're not looking for, I don't think the board would be looking for accuracy. Like, well, you only said it was going to be this next year, but.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna say this, we can definitely do that, and we do it to a smaller scale, but we can kind of put it together. The one thing I will say, it is going to be probably higher than what reality is gonna end up being, and that's because it's very difficult to determine staff turnover and that, and when you were saying about retirement, we got to know what salaries are, so we got to know what staff are, in order to do that. And we can definitely do that. That's not a problem. That's pretty easy to do. But I will say it's going to be higher than what reality probably will be. Just going to throw that out there. The other thing is you're talking. I'm just throwing this out as a thought. If you wanted to look at something like that in the additional fund balance, another place to possibly consider is paying off some of the debt. Because what that does is that pays off the debt, and then we don't have the interest costs from that. So it is also something we can look into if you'd like us to, because to me, that's a long-term impact to the taxpayer, that they're not paying that debt back. While we could give them a refund one time, if we pay the debt back for the next 5 years, that's going to be compounding over time, and potentially will keep us from having to raise taxes. So that is another thought that.
Yeah, that reduce an ongoing expense in a highly predictable way, which would be, then assuming that there's sufficient revenues, that would make it easier to justify an actual tax cut than a rebate, which is, so if you reduce an expenditure you knew you were going to have for the next 10 years, it's a lot easier to cut taxes based on the reduction in the expenditure.
Well, I was saying a little different. Like, what I was saying is you could reduce debt, and then with the, hopefully it will help you from having to then raise taxes. So
Yeah.
at the end of the day, it kind of does the same thing.
Yeah, the same things that help
Yeah.
you avoid raising taxes can also help justify a cut, just depending on what revenues are looking like. Okay.
Which was, so kind of going back to the fund balance and putting the money aside for the capital projects, which was the whole concept behind doing that, was that we wouldn't have to issue debt, because obviously there's a good bit of cost associated with debt. And right now, with that money sitting there, we're kind of lucked out. We really were able to issue our debt low. But this money sitting here, we have the highest interest rates we've had for quite a long time, so we are getting that money, which is kind of helping things too. So remember, if we reduce that, which we will reduce it, there's not a doubt, either we do a rebate or we do capital projects, or both, that is going to drive down the interest earnings, which then we'll have to fill that hole too. So just kind of throwing that whole piece in there.
Understood.
Well, and putting that number, that $560,000 into debt, has a long-term less expenditure. So, I'm not sure how long that's amortized out, but that could have a large impact over a great period of time.
What is the average rate on our debt right now? Do you happen to know off the top of your head?
Low. I don't.
Low?
I would estimate between 1.5% and 2.5%.
Okay.
It's pretty low. I mean, we have some coupons that are higher, obviously.
That's-
But don't quote me on that. We'll look at it. But it's pretty low debt. But interest earnings or interest expense over 30 years is still interest expense over 30 years. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So one and a
Still
half to
compounds.
2.5% is very low.
Yep. It's very low. So right now we borrowed low and we're investing high. So
Yeah.
it's what you
Yeah.
what you
Worked
try to
out
do. But we can take a look at that.
All right. Anything else any questions, further questions here? No?
Thank you so much to both of you.
Yes.
Great presentation.
Yeah, thank you for,
Yeah, can I just summarize real quickly? So
Absolutely.
by Thursday night, Friday morning, we will send you electronically the 2 documents that we talked about. Please, if you have questions or anything that we need to answer, if you could let us know. We definitely want to try to approve it at the April meeting. And I also want to point out, because I know when I was new, this was always the question I had, we can do any changes between April and May. We don't have to start over again. You can go up, down, sideways, doesn't matter. So if there is something, we could still approve in April, and it doesn't mean you can't make the change in May. So just wanted to kind of throw that out. If there's something you just weren't quite sure on, we could definitely get that answered between April and May if there's a concern. So I wanted to.
great.
Can I make a comment? I'm
Sure.
sorry.
Oh, no, you go ahead. No, I was good.
I don't want to make it until you're done.
No, I'm done.
This young lady has worked for this school district for a considerable amount of time. And she has an excellent reputation throughout the state of Pennsylvania. Other people in her same position in other school districts call her to ask for her recommendation. She knows what she's talking about. She knows her business. And she knows how to handle this amount of money. And to bring up $500,000 as being in excess.
Well, I'm pretty sure I should
Would
have
you
the
let me
the
finish?
right.
Would you give me a chance to finish, and then you can say your piece? We've just spent probably close to a half an hour talking about this $500,000, which what she's been trying to tell you is, and what Dr. Bryson told us, it can go like that. If that's the way you're going to start handling the money in this school district, God help us.
Well, Jim, I think I should have the right to have the taxpayer in mind as we're making these decisions. And you are fully capable of having your own opinion, and I respect that. And I also agree that Susan is doing a marvelous job.
Remarkable.
I enjoy very much working with her,
Yeah.
That's.
and I think she does a great job at Trevor as well.
I believe that's a unanimous
Yeah.
feeling on the board.
Yeah, no, I received, I got information from my aunt who spent a lot of time working with Sue Green as well, that she's really capable and is really of value to this district. So I think it's good to have conversation. Maybe you disagree with that, but, any conversation we have here is to the benefit of this district. We have the same drive for an excellent district as you do. So maybe we have difference of opinion as to how to get there, but I don't think that criticizing the rest of the board for having a conversation is really productive. So,
Well, and certainly, Mr. Holly, there's no disrespect meant at all. We absolutely appreciate all the work that has been done.
I heard a number of different opinions on the matter at this table. I don't, there's a good spectrum, I think, of views on this that give us a lot of room to explore different options that, some of them are very conservative, some of them are, some very conservative, some more aggressive, in terms of considering the taxpayer. And it is a balance. There's no doubt that it's a difficult thing to balance because there's so much uncertainty. And I think that's broadly respected. And I think no one here did not seem to recognize that that uncertainty does create challenges, especially the uncertain funding of things like interest rates. So I think on balance, on average, there's going to be a good consideration of all those factors.
And I think that the highest level of respect one can return to somebody who has put this level of detail in such a presentation is to contend with it. And that is what we're trying to do. And I'm not going to apologize for 30 minutes of contending. Sorry.
right. I'm going to entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting.
Second?
Okay.
Oh, so moved.
Do I have a second? All right. So we stand adjourned. Thank you, everybody.